the knock came at the door of the Duke of Ravenscar's own carriage, and the woman who opened her cottage door to him, 5 miles later, was holding a wooden sword in one hand and shouting, over her shoulder, that if a certain small person did not come down from the apple tree this instant, there would be no honey on his bread for a week. "I beg your pardon," Charlotte Ainsley said, turning back. "I am afraid you have found us at rather a bad," and stopped because the man on her doorstep was not a tenant, or a tradesman, or the vicar come about the roof, but a gentleman of such obvious and expensive standing that her whole small yard seemed to shrink around him. "Forgive the intrusion, madam." His eyes had gone past her, to the apple tree, and to the small dark-haired boy now hanging from its lowest branch, with his stockings around his ankles. And something in the man's face had gone entirely catastrophically still. "I am looking for a child, a boy of 5 years. He would have been left. I am told he was left somewhere in this parish, in the autumn of 11, and I have spent every month since." He did not finish the sentence. The boy dropped from the tree, ran across the yard, and buried his face in Charlotte's skirts, with the unthinking confidence of a child who has never once had cause to doubt whose skirts they were. And Julian Hardcastle, Duke of Ravenscar, looked down at his own son's face for the first time in 5 years, and could not speak at all. He had not abandoned the boy. That was the first thing Charlotte insisted on understanding, once she had put the child to bed and set a very fine Duke down at her very plain kitchen table, with a cup of tea he clearly had no idea what to do with. "His mother was my late brother's wife," Julian said. "She died of the fever the autumn the boy was born, and my brother followed her within the month, and the child went to a nurse in Bath while I was in Portugal with the regiment, and by the time I came home, the nurse had taken the money and gone, and the boy was simply gone with her." His hands had closed hard around the untouched cup. "I have spent 5 years and a great deal of money looking for the son of a brother I never got to bury properly. Every parish in 3 counties, every workhouse, every foundling hospital in England, I had begun to believe I was looking for a grave." "Portugal," Charlotte repeated. "You were at the war. I was at the war, and my brother was dying in Somerset, and I did not know either fact until both were 4 months old. The letters took that long." He said it flatly, the way a man says a thing he has said to himself several thousand times. "Do you know what I was doing the week the nurse took the money and went? I was being commended for gallantry at a river crossing whose name I have since forgotten entirely. I have the letter. It is in a drawer at Ravenscar, and I have never once been able to burn it." "He was left on my step in October," Charlotte said quietly. "No note, no name, a woman's voice in the lane, and then nothing at all. He was small enough that I could hold the whole of him in one arm." She looked toward the stairs, and her voice did not quite hold steady. "I went out into the lane after her. I want you to know that. I stood in the road in my nightdress, calling into the dark for a quarter of an hour because I thought, I was 22, and I thought surely someone is coming back for this child. Nobody came back. I carried him inside and I sat up the whole night with him on my chest, waiting for a knock that never came, and by morning I had stopped waiting and started counting what was in the pantry." She smiled, faintly, at nothing. "I called him Thomas, after my father. I did not know what else to call him, and I could not bear for him to have no name at all." "Thomas." Julian said it as though testing whether the word would hold his weight. "My brother's name was Thomas." Neither of them said anything for a long moment after that. "You must have a great many questions for me," Charlotte said at last, "and I find I have rather more for you, and I do not think either of us is going to sleep tonight regardless. So you may as well ask them. How did you feed him?" It was not, she thought, the question a duke was supposed to ask first. £90 a year is a curate's daughter's whole existence. A child is not a small addition to that arithmetic. "I took in mending. I taught the Smiths' daughters their letters for 8p a week apiece. I sold my mother's writing desk the first winter, and her pearls the second. And I have not once regretted either transaction, though I confess I miss the desk. She said it without any bid for sympathy, simply as a set of facts she had lived through. I have not been poor, Your Grace. I have been careful. There is a considerable difference, and I have found that people with money rarely believe it. Julian looked at her for a long moment across the table. My brother sold his commission to pay a friend's debt, he said. It was the single most foolish financial decision of his life, and I told him so at the time, in language I regret every day since. He said something to me then that I did not understand until about 4 minutes ago. He said that there are people who count what a thing costs before they do it, and people who count it afterward, and that the second sort are the only ones worth knowing. He set down the cup at last. I have spent my whole life being the first sort. I did not expect to find the second sort standing in a yard with a wooden sword. He came back the next day, and the day after that. He did not come with lawyers or with papers, or with the carriage he could very easily have loaded a small boy into at any moment of any of those afternoons. And Charlotte, who had spent 3 sleepless nights waiting for exactly that, found she did not know what to do with a Duke who instead spent an entire Tuesday on his knees in her yard, being savagely defeated at wooden swords by his own 5-year-old heir. You are not what I braced for, she told him on the 4th day, watching him lose a duel with elaborate and entirely convincing agony. What did you brace for? A man who would take him. She said it plainly, because there was no point dressing it. You could, you know. There is not a court in England that would side with a curate's daughter living on £90 a year against the Duke of Ravenscar. I have known that since the moment you stood on my step. I have been waiting 4 days for you to remember it. Julian got up off the ground, brushing grass from a coat worth more than her cottage, and looked at her with an expression she could not read at all. Madam, I have spent 5 years imagining the moment I found him. In none of those 5 years did I once imagine finding him fed and clothed and shouting from an apple tree and running toward a woman rather than away from one. He paused. You did all of that on £90 a year, with nothing owed to you and nothing promised. I did not come here to take him from the only person in England who has ever actually kept him. Then what did you come here for? I have not the faintest idea, he said, with such genuine bewilderment that she laughed before she could stop herself, and something in his face at the sound of it changed in a way neither of them was prepared to name. By the 2nd week the village had opinions, and by the 3rd it had very little else. The Duke of Ravenscar's carriage stood outside Charlotte Ainsley's gate 4 days out of 7, and the parish, which had spent 5 years regarding Charlotte as a respectable oddity, a curate's daughter with a foundling and no husband and no visible intention of acquiring one, revised its assessment of her with the speed and cruelty of a place that had very little else to discuss. They are saying he keeps you, Mrs. Pardoe told her at market, with the particular relish of a woman delivering an insult as a favour. I said it was nonsense. I said Miss Ainsley has never had a shilling she didn't earn. But you cannot have a Duke in your yard 4 days a week and expect the lane to hold its tongue, my dear. And you have a boy to think of. I have thought of very little else for 5 years, Mrs. Pardoe. Then think of it harder, the older woman said, not unkindly. A woman's name is the only property the law lets her keep outright, and you are spending yours very freely on a man who has a great deal more of everything than you do. Charlotte carried that home with her potatoes, and did not sleep well, because the worst of it was that Mrs. Pardoe was right, and because the truly unbearable part was not what the lane thought of her at all. It was that she had begun, sometime in the 2nd week, to look for the carriage. Lord Aubrey Hardcastle had been the presumptive heir to Ravenscar for 5 years, and had grown, over those years, extremely comfortable with the arithmetic of a lost child. And he arrived at Charlotte's cottage the following week, with a solicitor and a smile that had nothing behind it at all. "Miss Ainsley, I represent the family's interest in establishing whether this child is who my cousin has convinced himself he is. He did not sit. You will find when you are asked in a courtroom that you have no baptismal record, no note, no witness, and no proof whatsoever that the boy in your care is a Hardcastle rather than some labourer's inconvenient byblow you took in for the parish coin. And you will find, I think, that a woman who has been keeping a duke's supposed heir in a cottage, unmarried, unchaperoned, receiving him alone, 4 days in a week, will be asked some considerably less pleasant questions about her motives than her charity. You are threatening my character. I am observing, Miss Ainsley, that your character is the only thing standing between my cousin's delusion and a very tidy inheritance, and that characters like yours are remarkably easy to observe out of existence." He put on his hat. "Take the money he will surely offer you, and go quietly. It is the kindest end available to you. You have not once asked whether the boy is happy," Charlotte said. Aubrey paused at her door, genuinely puzzled. "I beg your pardon. You have been in my house 11 minutes. You have asked about records and witnesses, and my motives, and my reputation. You have not asked what he is like. You have not asked whether he can read, or what he is afraid of, or whether he sleeps through the night." She held the door open for him herself. "He is your cousin's son, my lord, and you did not ask his name. I think that is the whole of what I need to know about you, and I do not require 11 more minutes of it." He left, but he looked back at her once from the lane, with an expression that had gone from contempt to something considerably more careful, and Charlotte understood, closing her own door with hands that would not quite stop shaking, that she had just made an enemy of a man who had a great deal more to lose than she did. She did not take it. She went instead to the parish register and found, after 2 days bent over 5 years of the vicar's cramped and mildewed hand, the thing Aubrey had been quite certain did not exist, an entry. October 1811. A woman calling herself Mrs. Reed had passed through the parish and buried an infant that same week, a child dead of the fever, recorded by the vicar himself. But the register also recorded, in the same hand, the sale of that woman's horse and cart to the smith 3 days later, and the smith remembered her, and remembered that Mrs. Reed had left the parish on foot with no child at all, having arrived with 1 living and 1 dead. The nurse had lost her own child. She had kept the money, buried her own baby under the Hardcastle name to close the account, and left the living heir on the nearest doorstep, because a dead child settles a debt, and a living one is only ever evidence. Charlotte read the entry 4 times before she let herself believe it, and then sat back on the vestry's cold stone floor and found she could not entirely hate the woman. Mrs. Reed had buried her own baby that October. Whatever she had done afterward, the money, the lie, the doorstep, she had done it 3 days after standing in this same churchyard, watching a hole filled in, and Charlotte had spent 5 years discovering exactly how much of a person a very small child can occupy. She did not forgive her, but she understood, in a way she would never be able to explain to a courtroom, that the cruelest act in this entire history had been committed by a woman who was at that moment the second most bereaved person in the parish, and she had left him warm. Whatever else was true, the woman had wrapped the boy twice and left him on a step with a light in the window rather than in a ditch, and Charlotte had spent 5 years thinking about that particular detail more often than she had ever admitted to anyone. Charlotte sat in the cold vestry with the register open across her knees and understood, with perfect clarity, that she was holding the one thing that could prove Thomas was who he was, and that the moment she handed it to Julian, the boy she had raised for 5 years became a duke's ward, and she became a woman who had once been kind to him. "I have spent 4 days terrified he would take Thomas from me," she thought. "I understand now that no one is taking him. I am about to give him away myself, because it is the only honest thing left to do." She gave it to Julian that night, in her own kitchen, and she did not cry until after she had finished. This is the Smith's statement, and the register entry, and the burial. Aubrey will say you invented the child to keep the title from him. This is the proof he cannot argue with. She set it on the table between them. Take it to your solicitors. Take Thomas. He is your brother's son, and he deserves the whole of what that means, and I will not spend one day of his life standing between him and it. Julian did not touch the papers. He looked at her for a very long moment across her own kitchen table. You found the one thing in England that ends this, he said slowly, and your first act upon finding it was to hand it to the man it costs you everything to hand it to. Yes. Why? Because I love him, Charlotte said, and her voice finally, entirely broke. Because I have loved him since he was small enough to hold in one arm, and I did not ask where he came from, and I did not ask to be paid, and I do not get to keep him, simply because I want to. That is not what it is. That is not what any of it ever was. Then you are the only person I have met in 34 years, Julian said, who has ever loved something without also, somewhere underneath it, keeping an account of what the loving was owed. That is not a virtue, Your Grace. It is simply what it is. You do not get to be paid for a thing you would have done anyway. He crossed the kitchen and took her face in both hands and kissed her, and it was neither gentle, nor careful, nor remotely wise, and she did not stop him until Thomas's voice from the top of the stairs, asking with great indignation why nobody had come to hear his prayers, broke them apart before either had decided anything at all. She went up to him. Julian stood alone in her kitchen and listened, through the thin ceiling, to a woman with £90 a year hearing his brother's son say his prayers. The same prayers, in the same order, that his own mother had taught him 30 years before in a house with 400 rooms, and understood that he had spent 5 years searching for a child, and had somehow, without noticing when it happened, found the entire remainder of his life instead. Aubrey's last move came 4 days later, a magistrate's summons, alleging that Charlotte Ainsley had knowingly concealed a peer's heir for 5 years, for financial gain, and that she was, moreover, a woman of demonstrably loose character, now attempting to secure a duke by way of his son. It was a lie. It was also technically arguable, and it arrived on the morning Julian's own solicitors had advised him, in the flattest professional terms, that the surest way to protect Thomas's claim was to distance himself entirely from the woman in the cottage until the matter was settled. He read the summons, he read the advice, and for one long bitter hour, the man who had spent 5 years learning that everything he loved could be taken from him by simply looking away at the wrong moment, sat in his own study and considered, seriously, doing exactly what his solicitors advised. You will forgive me for speaking plainly, Your Grace, his solicitor had said, but every hour you spend at that cottage is an hour Lord Aubrey's counsel will hold up in a courtroom as evidence that the woman has an interest in the outcome. If she is disinterested, she is unimpeachable. If she is to be your wife, she is a witness with a motive, and the boy's claim rests on her word. The man had spread his hands. Stay away until it is settled. It is the one thing you can do that actually helps the child. It was. Julian recognised with a kind of sick clarity an argument he could not answer, and it arrived wearing exactly the shape of the only lesson his life had ever really taught him, which was that the things he loved were taken from him in the moments he reached for them. His brother, his brother's wife, 5 years of a child's life, gone while he was in Portugal doing his duty. A man learns, eventually, not to reach. He did not send for her. He told himself for 2 days that he was protecting Thomas's claim, and did not examine too closely how comfortably that reasoning fit the older, uglier habit underneath it. Charlotte, receiving no word for 2 full days, understood precisely what his silence was built from, and, understood too that she was the only person left who could end it. "He is frightened," she told the empty kitchen, and then, because there was no one to hear it, and she had earned the right to say it once aloud, "and I am done waiting in cottages for frightened men to decide things about my life." She walked into the magistrate's hearing herself, alone, without a solicitor, without Julian, and without the slightest intention of being spoken about in the third person, for one moment longer. "Lord Aubrey has told this room I concealed the boy for gain," she said, and her voice carried to the back of it. "I have never taken a shilling from the Hartcastle family. Here are 5 years of my own accounts, £90 a year, and every penny of what it costs to feed and clothe and school a child on it, which this room may examine at its leisure. And here," she set the register down beside them, "is the burial record of the nurse's own child under the Hartcastle name, and the Smith's sworn statement that she left this parish carrying nothing at all." The room had gone entirely silent. "His Grace's cousin has spent a fortnight asking what I wanted from this family. I will tell you plainly, since no one has troubled to ask me directly." She turned and looked at Aubrey rather than the magistrate. "I wanted the boy to have his name. That is the whole of it. I brought that register to His Grace myself, 3 days before you brought this summons, knowing exactly what it cost me. And you may ask him, under oath, whether I asked for a single thing in return. I did not conceal a duke's heir, my lord. I fed him. You are simply the only man in this room who cannot tell the difference." Julian rose from the back of the hearing, where he had been standing for some minutes without her knowledge, and said, quite clearly, "I will confirm every word of it, under oath, and I will add that Lord Aubrey approached Miss Ainsley privately a fortnight ago and instructed her to take money and go quietly, which she refused, and which my own footman witnessed from the lane." Aubrey came to his feet. "This is a woman with everything to gain. This is a woman," the magistrate said, in the flat voice of a man who has spent 30 years listening to people lie to him and has developed a certain ear for the exception, "who has just laid 5 years of accounts before this bench, showing she has spent every farthing she owns on a child she was not obliged to feed. And who brought the evidence that ends your claim to your cousin before you ever filed it? I have heard a great many motives argued in this room, my lord. That is not what greed looks like." He closed his book. "The summons is dismissed, and I would advise you, in the strongest terms available to me, not to bring me another one." Aubrey Hartcastle's career in that county ended in the following 11 seconds. He left England before the quarter sessions, and the family did not send after him. Julian found her outside, on the steps, before she had made it to the road. "You did that alone," he said, "because I was too much a coward for 2 days to do it beside you. You came, late and badly, and with your solicitors screaming at you the entire way, I imagine. But you came, and you said it under your own name in front of a magistrate, when staying silent would have served you better." She stopped on the step. "I have spent 5 years being the only adult in every room I have ever stood in, Julian. I did not need you to fight it for me. I needed to know that you would, if I ever did. That is a different thing, and I do not think men are generally taught the difference. I came late. I intend to spend a considerable amount of my life making up for the 2 days." He caught her hand. "Charlotte, I have a son because you opened a door in October and did not ask who he belonged to. I am not offering you a reward. There isn't one. There is no title and no settlement in England that measures what you did, and I have stopped trying to find one." He took a breath. "So I am asking you the only thing I actually have. Marry me. Not so the boy keeps his mother, so that I get to keep them both." "That," Charlotte said, "is the worst proposal I have ever heard, Your Grace. I am aware. I have had 2 days to compose something better, and I spent both of them being a coward instead, so this is regrettably the whole of what I have." He did not let go of her hand. "I will say the rest of it badly then. since I have already begun, you will be told for the rest of your life that you married above yourself. You will hear it in every drawing room in England from people who cannot count past a title. I want you to know that I have done the arithmetic myself, Charlotte, very carefully, and it comes out the other way round entirely, and I intend to say so in public, as often as anyone gives me the opening. They will say I schemed for it. They will. And you will know, and I will know, and in about 15 years a young man will know precisely what you did, and what it cost you, and how little you ever asked for it. His voice was not entirely steady. That is the only defence I have to offer you. It is not enough. I am asking anyway. Yes, she said, and kissed him on the magistrate's own steps in front of a great many witnesses who talked about it for years. They were married that autumn in her father's own small church, with the smith and his daughters in the third pew, and Mrs. Pardoe weeping loudly in the fourth. And a 6-year-old Marquess of Ainsley, a courtesy title Julian had insisted upon over his solicitor's bewildered protests, for reasons no one in the room needed explained, carrying the ring on a cushion with the fierce concentration of a boy who has been told a thing is important and has decided to believe it. The following spring, there was an apple tree at Ravensmoor. It had been moved at enormous expense, and against the advice of 3 separate gardeners, transplanted root and all from a cottage yard 5 miles distant, and it stood now at the corner of the south lawn, where a 6-year-old Marquess could be found in its lowest branches most afternoons, with his stockings around his ankles, shouting down at anyone who would listen. It had also, Charlotte noted with private satisfaction, produced 3 apples the previous autumn, all of which Thomas had claimed personally, and none of which anyone else had been permitted to touch. Otley says the last of Aubrey's claim was dismissed at the spring sessions, Julian said, settling onto the bench beside his wife. He is in Antwerp, I'm told, and considerably less comfortable than he was accustomed to. I find I am not moved, nor I. Charlotte watched the boy climb higher than was strictly advisable, and decided, as she did most afternoons, to allow it. He asked me this morning whether I was his real mother. He is 6, and he has heard the servants talk, and I had rather he heard it from me. What did you tell him? That someone left him on my step in the autumn, and I kept him, and that his father spent 5 years looking for him and never once stopped. She leaned into her husband's shoulder as the last of the light went gold across the lawn. He thought about it for a while, then he asked if he might have honey on his bread, and went to climb the tree. Julian laughed. That is the whole of it then. 5 years of searching, 2 solicitors, a magistrate, and a transplanted apple tree, and the boy's chief concern is honey. That is what it looks like when a child has never once had to worry about being kept, Charlotte said. You spent 5 years looking for him, and I spent 5 years feeding him, and neither of us gets any credit from him at all, because to him, none of it was ever remarkable. He simply has a mother and a father and an apple tree, and he cannot conceive of a world in which he might not have had them. She watched the boy reach for a branch that would certainly not hold him, and decided, as she did most afternoons, to let him find that out himself. I think that may be the only thing either of us has ever done that was worth doing. A year ago, Julian said, I had a title, 11 properties, 40,000 a year, and no earthly idea where my brother's son was buried. I have never in my life been able to make that arithmetic come out. And then a woman with £90 a year opened a door in October, and it simply came out. All of it, without her ever once asking to be paid. You have got to stop saying that in public, Julian. Lady Beresford very nearly wept into the fish. I intend to say it in public, until I die, he said, and kissed his wife's temple, and neither of them said anything for a long while, the 2 of them sitting under a tree that had no business growing where it grew, watching a boy who had no business being where he was, in a life that no title in England had ever been capable of measuring.